Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar where we're going to be looking at navigating an economic downturn whilst really importantly looking after your people. So this is a really topical and really currently relevant issue that we're going to be talking around today. How do we ensure that we're focusing on our people, their well-being and being a responsible business at the same time as tackling some really difficult economic issues? So I'm delighted that we've got a great panel of 4 speakers ready to share their insight with us around this topic. They're going to be looking at dealing with organisation change, including downsizing, in a way that hopefully limits potential job losses, but ultimately treats people with compassion and treats people with care. Before I introduce my speakers, I will introduce myself. My name is Jill Miller. I work at the CIPD in our public policy team, specialising in diversity and inclusion. So really pleased to be chairing this session today. I'll be introducing the speakers and as well fielding some of your comments and questions at the end of the webinar. But to get on to our speakers who you've come here today to hear from. First up, we will be hearing from Rachel Suff, who is a Senior Policy Advisor at the CIPD. She specialises in employee relations and employee wellbeing, and Rachel will be setting the context and setting the scene for us today. Then we'll be hearing from Maddie Stevens, who is a Senior Lecturer in Human Resource Management at Liverpool John Moores University. The majority of Maddie's career has been in HR as a practitioner before she moved into academia. And her research is really topical for today, focuses on the impact of redundancies in organisations and people. And Maddie is going to be talking about the wider support needed for those remaining in the workforce. And I think this is a really important point, not forgetting the people professionals and HR managing workforce change. We'll then be going to Katie Obi, who is the Chief People Officer on the leadership team at Beamery. And Katie leads the people function there, as well as really quite exciting, has responsibility for designing and implementing a business and customer-centric talent strategy for the business. And Katie will be drawing on knowledge as well from her previous roles, where she's focused on business transformation, supporting business growth through its people, and she'll be sharing her experiences there of managing change. And I'm really delighted that we have Alan Lewis with us as well today, who is a partner at Constantine Law. Alan's worked in corporate law before becoming an employment lawyer. He advises businesses of all sizes, and you may recognise his name from being a frequent contributor to People Management magazine. He'll also be on hand in the Q&A section as well. But before I'm able to hand over to our speakers, a few housekeeping things from me. This session is being recorded. It will be available on demand on the webinar section of our CIPD website. And there you can also find previous recordings and find out what's coming up next. So do take a look at our webinar webpage. Also, during the session, we would like to hear from you, of course, with your thoughts, with your questions. So just to let you know where to pop those, to submit questions to the panel, please put them in the Q&A box. Ideally not the chat box, as that's not checked as regularly. The chat box mainly for networking with fellow attendees. So if you want to post to everybody, share with everyone, it's to use all panels and all attendees within the chat box networking function. And all attendees are muted during the course of the webinar. Some additional resources that might be helpful to let you know about. We're updating the frequently asked questions and all the resources on our CIPD website regularly as new information becomes available. So please do check that for sort of new things that we're publishing all the time. We have a wellbeing hub as well there, along with many other different types of hub for CIPD members, and of course a wide array of fact sheets on our website. Also, really useful to know that CIPD members can get individual legal advice from our HR Inform helpline, which is available 24/7. And also to let you know that CIPD members in the UK and Ireland can access our Wellbeing Hub and helpline. So together with award-winning workplace wellbeing provider Health Assured, We now provide CIPD members with free help and support 24/7 and 365 days a year via telephone or online consultations with qualified therapists. Members can access the phone number and the online services via the membership benefits webpage. And you can see more details about this at the end of this session. But that's all from me in terms of housekeeping up front and useful resources. So I know you're online to hear from our speakers, so I'm going to get things started and hand over to our first speaker, Rachel Suff, who's going to set the scene for our webinar. Rachel is a policy advisor at the CIPD. So I'm going to hand straight over to you now, Rachel.
Thanks so much, Jill, and hi everyone. So pleased you can make it. So as Jill said, as my next slide shows, I want to set the context for what's happening at the moment in terms of that external environment, not only in terms of influencing organisations and navigating the downturn and decisions that some of you will have to make, tough decisions over the next few months in terms of restructuring and downsizing and so on, but also in terms of how this external environment is impacting on people as well. We're still living in very turbulent and uncertain times. It's almost 3 years, can you believe it, since the onset of the pandemic, but it can actually feel at the moment as if it's crisis upon crisis. And if we just think about some of the major things that are happening at the moment, we've got the cost of living crisis, spiralling fuel prices, and then we've got political instability as well. It can feel like a very uncertain world for people. We've had the war in Ukraine that's still ongoing. And then in terms of the economy, of course, which is going to influence the subject of this webinar, the Bank of England predicts a very challenging time ahead. Likely recession for the whole of next year and into 2024 as well. So really, VUCA, the world we have is volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous as well. I do want to say something positive as well at this point, because I think let's not forget that through the crises, we have seen innovation, new ways of working. I think we've seen more focus on people's health and well-being, more care and compassion as well. So it's not all negative. There are positive things to build on as we navigate the times ahead. But we do need to remember, I think, that wider picture context in terms of people's mental health and well-being. And for many people, it will have been compromised over the last period. And so have that at the forefront of our minds, I think, as we look ahead. And with that theme in mind, if we look at the next slide, this is just to flag really that although we are now living with COVID, there is a long tail of the pandemic, and this is our findings from our Health and Wellbeing at Work Survey report, which I just think shows how some of the enduring impacts for some people in terms of their health are very real and ongoing. For example, the impact on some people's mental health doesn't necessarily end when the pandemic ends. Also, some people are unfortunate enough, around 2 million at the moment with long COVID. So a lot of people's mental health continues to be compromised. And if we look at the view of employees, which is on the next slide, because I think it's important that we do take on board where are people at the moment in terms of their well-being generally. And you can see the red, if we focus on the red bar graphs, this shows what employees said when we asked them what their health and well-being is like. Mental health in terms of the red line. It's our Good Work Index that we published in June. It's a snapshot, but it asks employees at work. And we can see here that most, 58%, said their mental health was good or very good, but 18% said poor or very poor. Now, when we talk about well-being and mental health, not everybody in that category, that 18%, necessarily has a mental health condition that's diagnosed. Our mental health fluctuates, of course. Can't expect to feel good, great all of the time. But I think what organisations do need to be aware of is that some groups, in particular individuals, their mental health will be quite vulnerable at the moment. For example, if they've already had a pre-existing mental health condition. Also young people. In our survey, but in other research, it does show that their mental health is tending to be poorer at the moment. So it's just not making judgments on people, but bearing in mind this wider context. And as we go into, if we look at the next slide, in terms of, that economic picture and the influence that's going to have on organisations in terms of restructuring and redundancy. And this is a slide from another one of our surveys that we published very recently on labour market outlook and indicators. And it shows redundancy intentions. And we can see that although they're very low still, 16% of employers said they intended to make redundancies to the end of the year, and that's ticking up from 13% last quarter and the quarter before. I think what we have to bear in mind is that indicators like redundancies and unemployment are lagging indicators. So you can expect these to increase. And indeed, the Bank of England predicts that the number of redundancies and unemployment as well is on that upwards trajectory. So that's a very brief snapshot of the picture of redundancies. Now, if we look at the next slide, because I really want to stress here the importance of genuinely considering alternatives to redundancy. Here are just some of the approaches that employers in our labour market outlook have consistently shown over the last 2 or 3 years to consider, which is encouraging, because there are a lot of different alternatives, and there's a responsibility for organisations to really look at those seriously, consider suggestions as well from employees who may be at risk of redundancy too. So here are some of the main ones. Temporary layoffs, recruitment freezes, redeployment, of course, wage flexibility. Now, of course, this might be more problematic in the current climate because of the financial pressures on people and the cost of living crisis. However, if the alternative is layoffs and reducing headcount, it could be more palatable. And I think you might be surprised, considering that some people have changed their aspirations and attitudes around work, reduced hours, short-term working, for example, reduced hours. It's always worth exploring these alternatives. And somebody has said job sharing, yes, or be creative, consult, engage with your people, because you might be surprised, you can be creative. But then if we look at the next slide, it could still be unavoidable. Obviously, it goes without saying that redundancy, laying people off, is the last resort, and people need to know that it's the last resort in their organisation as well. But no doubt, a lot of organisations could be making some very tough decisions in the months ahead. And it's a really hard undertaking for our people professionals and for employers to make job cuts. Nobody's going to approach that with any kind of, in one sense, positivity, especially in the current climate, but it could be unavoidable. I think it is important to bear in mind as well the impact on the people who are carrying out that process, which could be yourselves very likely, also line managers as well, who are going to be the first port of call very likely for people. So really important, I think, that we obviously comply with the law, and there's a lot of law around redundancy, that's a given. But I just want to talk in the next slide really about how important it is to handle those redundancies, as Jill said, with compassion, with people at the centre, and focus on their well-being as well. And it really does go hand in hand with compliance, actually. So here we go, here's some pointers. And I think, first off, what is compassion? Let's just think about what that word compassion means as well, because it's not fluffy. Actually, yes, it does mean having empathy, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand what they're feeling, having that consideration, that care, that kindness. But actually, in the world of work and for our people professionals, it means being prepared to also act on their situation. Now, what does that mean in a restructuring redundancy situation? It doesn't mean necessarily not making those redundancies. They really could be unavoidable. But what it means is that you can take a number of steps to improve the process and how that's carried out, and also how people are treated, how you approach it, because it will make, I don't think you can underestimate the amount of difference it will make to people. So first of all, key principle, obviously, is treating people with dignity, respect and kindness. And it really does make a big difference, the how you go about it, not necessarily what. The outcome might be the same, but if you're treated with dignity, respect and kindness, it will make such a difference to how people feel able to cope and move on, look to the future, leave with their dignity and respect intact. And communication. I don't think you can communicate too much, really, during a restructuring and redundancy process. People need information, they need answers, so it needs to be two-way, very definitely as well. You need to, there needs to be a lot of listening and communicating back on based on what people's concerns are. But it's also the tone of your communications as well, because if you don't communicate enough, the rumour mill will step in to fill the vacuum as well, and that could be quite harmful. People need to know that it was the last resort, that they're valued, that it's the role that's being made redundant, and not them as a person because of a reflection of their performance and so on. So that's all really important. And then provide ongoing health and wellbeing support. Whatever you can provide, do provide it. And on those people as well who are the messengers, who are breaking the news and carrying out the process too. So continually offer that support. Also, does your employee assistance programme, if you have one, offer support for people who've been made redundant after they've left the organisation? Because some do, sometimes up to 3 months. So do explore that and see if that's a possibility. Outplacement support can be much cheaper now. Practical support to help find another job, very important. And now there's virtual offerings that are much cheaper. So look into that, and then be mindful of the potential impact on the wider workforce. There needs to be a strategy for maintaining morale, helping people look to the future, and making sure that people know they have a place in the future of the organisation. People will be looking to see how their colleagues were treated. It's a huge test of your employment relations, actually, to see, to go take people through a redundancy programme. And people will be looking to see how their friends, their colleagues were treated, because that will be a reflection on how are they valued in the organisation as well. So it's critically important for you to, in moving on as an organisation. Training support line managers, finally, can't emphasise this enough. I've already said how they're the first protocol, can have a real effect on them in terms of their health and well-being, but they need the information because they will be faced with a lot of questions. They might be part of the redundancy situation as well, but they need guidance, they need support. Finally, I just want to say that compliance and compassion can go hand in hand. I'm not in any way playing down how challenging a redundancy or restructuring programme can be. And you might not be able to influence the final outcome of what happens in terms of job cuts, but how you handle it will have a lasting legacy, not only on the people who are leaving and how they can move on, but on your own workforce and your organisation. And it is possible to do it well. And we've got lots of resources to help you do that. Thank you.
Great, thank you ever so much, Rachel. I think you've really set the context well for us there. And I think what came through for me from your presentation was the importance of not forgetting that we're dealing with people here. And I think that's a key theme that flows really nicely into Maddie's session. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Maddie Stevens, who is the Senior Lecturer in HRM at Liverpool John Moores University. So thank you very much, Maddie.
Thank you very much, Jill and Rachel. As Jill's introduced before, my passion is about finding solutions to mitigate the negative impact of redundancies on organizations, but also very much on the individuals. Thank you, Christian. So just positioning first as a reminder for what is redundancy as demarcated in law. Essentially, a redundancy occur if the employer ceased or intend to cease the organization or the business. So this means business closure, or perhaps a part of the business that may be closing down. It could be a particular roles that are no longer required due to a merger, acquisition, duplication of roles, or just ceasing or diminishing requirement in business, as we're currently seeing within the economic downturn. Thank you, Christian. So why do organizations implement redundancies? It's a very popular human resource management and also change management strategy that's been used for the last few decades. And the knee-jerk reaction typically is to drive costs. Immediate cost reductions are what's perceived by organizations as the benefit of redundancies, often driven to increase levels of efficiency, productivity, profitability, and competitiveness within the marketplace. Quite often it's also driven by automation, where humans are replaced by automated services. Thank you. So there's no surprise, but during COVID, we've seen a spike in the UK of an increase in redundancies. The first spike you see there is during the financial crash of 2008, 2009. But you can see in the UK during COVID, it's reached a ridiculous height of 14.5 in 1,000 people being made redundant in the three-month period within the UK. Thank you, Christian. Just from another perspective here, you see the red line is the impact of COVID-19 and the reaching a peak there of 16% compared to the blue line during the global financial crash. Globally, we saw 244 million jobs being lost due to redundancies during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we then move on to look at what's currently happening with redundancies, it's important to remember that everybody in the organization is impacted by redundancies. Firstly, we have the victims, who are the employees who leave the organization, who are unfortunate enough to lose their jobs. Then we have the survivors who remain in the organization after the program is complete. We also then have a new group called the semi-survivors, which are employees that were first victims. In other words, they may have been put at risk or even made redundant, and then rehired and became survivors, or maybe redeployed somewhere else in the organization. Quite often also organizations dismiss employees for reason of redundancies and then realize they need employees back and then rehire them. And then finally, the group here today is our redundancy envoys, which is typically managers and HR professionals who are entrusted with the role of implementing redundancies, often an overlooked population that's incredibly important to the success. Thank you. So what's currently happening post-COVID, there was an increase in work and employment, and now with the new economic situation, we see first the tech giants that's all in the last couple of weeks announced major redundancies. Facebook, Meta, 11,000 employees being removed globally. Then Twitter, the same with global redundancies being announced, also heavily critiqued for their lack of compassion with how they're implementing redundancies. We then look at the next slide of retail being impacted. Jules going into 2 stages of redundancy, first 1,600 employees, and now the next round looking at senior directors. Thank you, Christian. And the May.com also entered into administration with 320 jobs being made redundant, now merging with Next, who's looking at the next level of redundancies. So multiple redundancy programs being implemented, which is really quite intimidating and scary and creating job insecurity across the board. And finally, the next one, which has come out recently, is Royal Mail, who plans 5,000 redundancies. There's also been the related strikes to that. And in this week, HSBC has also announced redundancies within the UK alone. So significant worries all along, because as we see this happening in the media, you know, we naturally wonder about how is this impacting in your own environment and your own job. So it's important to focus on, sorry to see, I've got a big light shining on me there. Sorry about that. Light shining in, shouldn't complain. So if we look at the symptoms of survivors syndrome, so these are the people who stay in the organization. There's no surprises here, but they have increased workload because colleagues have left, so they have to pick up 1, 2 roles, maybe 3 sometimes. They have guilt that they experience because sometimes they feel why have a colleague had to go, perhaps with a new young family or a new house they've built, and they feel guilty thinking that person were more suitable or deserved to stay. They also feel envy. Sometimes people want to leave. They may be close to retirement and having a large settlement, a larger settlement that they are keen to get due to years of service. And they are jealous that they have to stay and their colleagues get to go. So I'm not going to go through each one, but there's a range of emotion that is left in the organization that we as HR professionals need to manage, including this job insecurity, depression, fear, and anxiety. Thank you, Christian. So what is the impact on redundancy voice? So us as HR professionals, the impact is a combination of what victims experience, so resentment, anger, but also what survivors experience, because essentially we are survivors, but we also feel the fear, the frustration, guilt, anger, disappointment, and often embarrassment that we are in the situation from a business perspective. There could be shock, envy, and blame. So a roller coaster of emotion that HR professionals need to deal with. And that's very important, as Rachel pointed out, that the compassion remains with the people who's entrusted with this responsibility. Thank you. So the importance of your role, when you're implementing redundancies, the research has indicated that you can have a significant impact on the success of the redundancies, not only by showing compassion towards the people who leave, but also towards the future success of the business. So the way it's being implemented, the way you communicate redundancies, but also protect the leaders and redundancy invoice who has to deal with this difficult change management process, can have significantly positive impacts for the organization. Thank you. So what's focus on the support you can give employees. Think about being calm, encourage them to move on. Redundancy employee victims experience a similar grief curve, going through shock, denial. So try and help them move on through the curve as best as possible. And the reason why this is important for HR professionals is if you can help them move on, it also helps you as an implementer by removing your own guilt, by seeing them through the process. Thank you, Christian. Support for survivors. Rachel has touched on this already, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but think about counseling sessions. How can you help them from an emotional perspective? How can you help them with an increased workload? It's important to reward and recognize people that remain in the organization. And it doesn't always have to be financially driven to recognize people. Thank you. And then very importantly, how do we support each other? Now, my research has clearly indicated that there's a strong partnership between HR and management, a real collegiance and collaboration that can come out from implementing redundancies together. And it's important that in this ivory tower, as often seen, You support one another through the stress of managing redundancies. It's often very difficult who you can share information with because of the nature of confidentiality. But within HR management, you can bounce ideas of one another, share the unpleasant experiences that you may be going through, the good experiences you're going through. Support groups are really essential in helping us. Counseling is not just there for victims and survivors, they're also there for HR professionals. Use redundancy veterans. People who have implemented redundancies a few times tend to be more resilient to experiencing the stress. And keep a proximity to the victims. In other words, if you have to make really close colleagues redundant, try and get another person involved to take away that emotional drain on yourself. Of course, planning is critical during redundancies, not only to focus on law, but also on the overall process. Thank you, Christian. I just wanted to share, it's an 8-step strategic redundancy implementation model that I've designed that focus on refocusing the organization, how to reorganize it, and finally how to rebuild. I'm not going to go through each step, but it may be really helpful if you are in the unfortunate position to implement redundancies at this time. Please draw on it and feel free to use it. Thank you. Finally, this is all coming from my book that's come out this year. So if you need any further help, please feel free to email me. I'm very happy to offer advice for anybody that needs that. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you ever so much, Maddie, for sharing your research with us, and really helpful to think in terms of the different groups that can be impacted within a redundancy situation, and the best support we can then provide, of course, for each of those groups, which came across strongly in your presentation. So thank you very much. Just a reminder to our audience that if you have any questions that have arisen from Maddie's presentation or from Rachel's presentation, please do type them into the Q&A box. You don't need to wait to the end. If you would like to post them up as we go, then please do. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Katie Obi, who is the Chief People Officer at Beamery, who is going to build on Rachel and Maddie's presentation, talking about her experiences of managing change. So thank you very much for joining us, Katie.
Thank you so much, Jill, and what fabulous resources and information has already been provided today by Rachel and Maddie. Really, really excellent things that will help anyone going through this kind of situation. Maybe as a little bit of background, so I've only been at Beamery for a couple of months, so we haven't been through this process with Beamery, but my previous organisations that I've been with, I've always worked in organisations that are going through a massive transformation agenda. And I've worked for a number of organisations that are private equity backed. I've been at organisations that have quite a significant M&A agenda, ones that are going through rapid growth and scale ups, and ones that are actually coming through the other cycle of business as well. So restructuring and winding down, a lot of offshoring, a lot of outsourcing, and of course, working through economic impacts. And as Rachel talked about some of the events that have happened over the past few years, I think the Collins Dictionary put in permacrisis as its word of the year. And I mean, from an HR standpoint, it really feels like we're lurching from one crisis to another right now. So for anyone who's on the call right now who is going through this, I feel with you and for you. It has been a really difficult past few years, and it looks like the next couple of years are going to be difficult too. So one thing that I will say is look after yourself and look after your team. It is really important. We are the ones who need to stay resilient through this. And as Maddie said, there are impacts on us and our teams too. We have to put our best foot forward to try and give people the best experience we can going through this. And we can only do that if we also put our own oxygen mask on first. I also think there is no such thing as a good redundancy process. The only good redundancy process is when you don't have to do it, but there are ways that you can do it spectacularly badly, which mean that you have such an impact on the organisation. And what it means is, often when organizations go through an organizational change or go through a round of redundancies, they think very carefully about who is going to stay in the organization and who is going to leave, and often go down to the very minimum workforce that they can to do what the business needs to do and to function through a particular period. And if you get it wrong, all of your strongest people that you're relying on to get through that process will opt out and they will leave. They will see how other people are treated. They will feel the fear and the anxiety that Maddie was talking about. And then a business will find it really hard to recover from that. And one of the other things is recovering out of a crisis is just as important for the stability of an organization as acting quickly when a crisis is, it has started to be identified. So really treating people, as Rachel said, with dignity, respect, and kindness, so important. We also, I think Rachel also touched on communication as well. And one of the pieces of advice I would have is try wherever possible to minimize surprises. So there always has to be a communications plan that builds gradually with when the business starts to notice that there are impacts on the organization's financials or the organization's strategy that might need to change to pivot in a particular crisis. And be as transparent as you can around that with employees so that they know what's happening, and also be transparent with all of the other things that you're trying to do before you have to go down a redundancy route. Rachel gave some really great ideas of what you and your organizations can look at in terms of alternatives to redundancies. And I would say try and be as transparent as you can around things. You don't want to scare people off, of course. You don't want to panic people. But if people have seen that you have thought about every single other alternative first before going down this route, that will mean that you'll have a lot more trust and a lot more buy-in as you're going through this process. I think the other thing is that's really important is around kindness as well. And Rachel and Maddie both talked a lot about this. Compassion and empathy go a really long way around this. I think none of us have escaped seeing things out on social media about mass firing text messages and Zoom calls and that kind of thing. And of course, the answer to that is don't ever do that. But think about the person, think about the person's situations and the impacts. Not everyone is impacted in the same way through this, and understand where someone is at from a human perspective and try to give as much support as possible. We don't all have the opportunities to be able to handle redundancies in the way that we've seen some companies do it, with massive severance packages, and that's quite, I wouldn't say an easy way of doing it. This is never easy, but that's a really nice way. If you have the cash to be able to do that, that's great. But a lot of organizations, when they get to the stage of this decision, are doing so for cash purposes and don't have the ability to be able to offer more than what is required from a statutory standpoint. But there are other ways that we can offer support through this. Rachel, I think it was you that mentioned about EAPs. Outplacement services is another good option. If you have an internal recruiting team, get them involved to be able to help employees who are leaving the company to brush up their CVs, to tap into different recruiter networks that are out there. My current company, actually, before I joined, so I can take no credit for this, they during COVID they set up a portal where we could help to connect employees with other organizations and with our customers as well. And I think always trying to help someone land the next opportunity is, it goes a long way as well in terms of helping to reduce the impact on people. I would say always talk to people about how they wish to leave as well. How do they want to say goodbye to their teams? Those kind of moments of closure can be really important to people, and then the survivor guilt is real, and Maddie, great research on that too, and some really good talking points. I think working with people, both acknowledging what they're going through and the emotions that they're feeling, working through that and acknowledging that that's there is really important. To expect that the day after this is announced, someone is working at 100% performance and productivity. They've just whipped up all of the work that has been left behind through colleagues that are no longer with them. That is not kind, and it's not realistic. So actually, acknowledging where people are at and the process that people are going through, spending time listening, encouraging your leaders to be out there talking to as many people and being as visible and close as possible, and also thinking about how workload will be managed, and how giving people potentially a little bit of time off to be able to process some of these things, or a slightly reduced workload, will help people be more resilient through this. Some things to avoid if possible. I'm not saying whether I have witnessed this or not, that shall remain a secret, but some things to avoid. So I would always try to avoid a Friday to announce any of this kind of thing, or to start a consultation process, because people need people to talk to. And if they can't talk to anyone from the HR team or from their leadership over that weekend period, people will immediately jump to the worst possible conclusions, and it will be very stressful for people. So do it so that there's time to be able to have one-to-one discussions with people as quickly as possible, without leaving people to stew on the news. Same thing with doing things before major holidays. If you can possibly avoid it, do not do things before a major holiday. The other thing that I would also say is try wherever possible to contain what's happening to happen once across an organization. Don't have different departments doing things at different times. And wherever possible, if you have to do this, do it once. And don't do it so that you have to do the same thing every couple of months or anything like that, because it becomes very difficult for people to go through that cycle again and again, and your strongest people will opt out from that environment. Do train and support your managers. I always try to script my managers wherever possible. Do role plays with managers as well, especially the ones that you've never seen in that process. We often assume that it's our more junior managers who are not used to doing these conversations, but I would say be cautious with that assumption, because I've seen a lot of senior people as well who have never had to do that. Either someone on their team has had to do it, or they've been in a part of a business or an industry where they haven't had to do that and they've moved. So always assume that someone could do with more training and someone can do with more support going through it, and that will help you out. Also think really carefully about who is the right manager to deliver the news. It may not be the person's immediate next supervisor. It might be someone, they might have worked for somebody in the fairly recent past that they have a really good rapport and relationship with, and that may be the kinder option to have the conversation with that person. And then one of the things that I think is more recent as well is around social media. So we've seen a lot of things go out on LinkedIn where the process and the communications around a redundancy is actually published on LinkedIn or on social media. It can make national media as well. So always look through your communications and your approach and what you're offering through this process with the lens that there's a high chance that someone will publicize this on social media and it will have very public attention. And I think it's really important to be aware that that can happen. And the other thing that we also tend to see is your Glassdoor will take a massive beating going through this too. So also working out how to respond in a kind and compassionate way around this, how to make sure that you're talking with new hires in the organization that are maybe parts of the organization that are less impacted by the actions that you're taking. You have to be able to balance out some of that messaging and own some of it too, in terms of what has happened. So those would be my main pieces of advice around the journey that we're going on. And as I say, take time to look after yourself. I never sleep before these kind of events. I'm sure a lot of you are the same as well. And I always tell myself that if it isn't hard, then we're not the right people to do it. Because if we're finding it hard, it's because we understand what's happening to people. And that helps us to be able to come from a place of empathy, kindness, respect, and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie, for sharing that with us, and love the point that you end on about empathy, kindness and dignity. Thank you for so generously sharing your experience, your insight with us. I think there's some real practical takeaways and food for thought there. So thank you very much. I'm now going to pass over to Alan Lewis, who is a partner at Constantine Law, and he's going to pick up on some of the legal aspects of some of the issues raised in this webinar so far. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Jill. And there was wonderful presentations there by Rachel, Maddie and Katie, some great points. I'll try and touch on some of them. So first slide, please. Change the slide. Yeah, thank you, that's great. I think the most important piece of advice I can give you from all my experience in dealing with redundancy situations from a legal aspect is to plan. I'll give you one example in my experience. I was once required by a company in the retail space to advise them on closing 103 branches throughout the UK. And funnily enough, 3 years later, we had to close another 108, having said we would be closing no more. Now, I spent half a day in a hotel with the head of HR weeks before that started, probably 3 or 4 weeks before that started, planning out how this process was going to happen. And the result of that, with a very experienced head of HR who followed initial advice and only touched base with me when she needed to, was that we were able to exit across those 2 exercises over 1,000 people in a way in which only 2 individuals made a claim to an employment tribunal, and they were both settled in aggregate for less than £5,000. It was an incredible result. There wasn't much trouble caused, and it was because it was planned properly. So that's fundamental. Now, we've already looked at the reasons for redundancy. It's a closure of a business, a closure of a place of work, or reduced need for employees to carry out work of a particular kind. I'd just like to touch on one point there. Remember that if you're moving premises, if you're moving to new premises, it doesn't look as though you're going to lose people. But there is a possibility that some of your staff may not want to move. It may be too far to travel. So you could have a redundancy situation. So take advice and plan for possible consultation. Clearly, if you've got more than 20 employees who have been required to move, then in theory, it's possible that all 20 will, or all of them will say we're not moving, and therefore you've got a collective redundancy situation. So don't overlook that. When I'm talking about collective redundancy, if we're making 20 or more individuals redundant at one establishment within a 90-day period, then we have to have a 30-day consultation period with union or elected employee representatives before the first of those dismissals takes effect. If it's 100 or more employees, then we have to have a 45-day consultation. Now, it's very interesting here, isn't it? We've talked about looking after survivors, those who are going to stay in the organisation. Unusually, the law on redundancy doesn't look at this situation the same way that the law on TUPE for transfer of undertakings does. In a TUPE situation, we will have to consult with maybe our existing employees as to how the changing work pattern is going to affect them when we bring new people in. Or if we're losing people, there may be more work to be done by the existing survivors. And there's a requirement in law to consult with those survivors. But it's not the same requirements in a redundancy situation. Initially, we'll have to consult with the workforce in general that they're at risk. But then the consultation will focus more on those who are selected and identified as provisionally redundant. So remember, we have collective consultation with those numbers I've talked about with representatives. But even if we have collective consultation, we still have to consult individually with any employees before they're made redundant. And it's really important. The general requirements are that we must consult at the formative stage. So when we are contemplating, when we realise that there may well have to redundancies, we have to start consultation early. We must provide enough information for employees to raise issues with us that they might want to consult about. And we must give them enough time to consult. Apart from the 30 and the 45-day consultation periods I've mentioned, there is no fixed time period in law for consulting with individuals. It's just what a tribunal would say is reasonable. And reasonable can be as short as a couple of weeks. And that's common in small businesses. I would advise on having a general meeting with staff to inform them that there are a risk of redundancies, And then once selection's been carried out and we've identified who's likely to be made redundant, I would advise having at least 2 individual, if not 3 individual meetings with those people to give them a chance to consult properly. Otherwise, it looks like a sham exercise. And from an industrial relations point of view, we're not treating our people with respect. Now, come on to looking at the pools. We have to identify the pools of people we're going to select from. And this is difficult, but there's a wide breadth of discretion to each employer. There is no fixed and fast way of selecting the correct pool. It's whatever a reasonable employer might think is a reasonable pool. So, for example, we may want to lose, for example, some receptionists, but it might not just be the people who carry out the reception work that are in the pool. They may do some typing work, some secretarial work. So we may have to pool them with some of our secretaries because we've got interchangeable skills. Sometimes it's a difficult challenge, and it's one that you might want to consult with lawyers and HR professionals about to get that right. Next slide, please. Looking at bumping. So bumping is not obligatory, but sometimes can be seen as unfair if you don't do it. So bumping is where we've identified we need to lose a particular role, but we might not necessarily make redundant the person or people who do that role. We might move somebody else into doing that role, and therefore somebody else is bumped, in effect, a bumped redundancy. It's not obligatory to consider bumping, but there has been cases where the process was found to be unfair because the employer did not give that consideration. So it's something to look at. If we're selecting from the pools to identify which people we're going to make redundant, it's important to draw up fair selection criteria and score them fairly, as objective as possible. Many years ago, we used LIFO, last in, first out. You can still use that as a criteria, but it must be mixed in with lots of other criteria because it could be discriminatory. Apart from the scoring exercise, we may have selection interviews. So if we've got a reorganisation and there's some new jobs created, rather than scoring people, we might invite candidates to apply and then we interview. Much easier to select fairly when we interview because it's very subjective down to how an individual performed at interview. Remember, maternity is a special case. If whilst a lady's on maternity, a redundancy situation arises, that employee is entitled to first refusal, in effect, to any alternative jobs that are offered. It's a case of positive discrimination. The government is looking at extending that now, extending that period, not for just somebody who's on maternity, but for somebody from the moment they notify their employer that they are pregnant until 6 months after they return from maternity leave. Redundancy pay, check whether there's a contractual enhanced entitlement. Also at the outset, check whether you've got a contractual redundancy process that needs to be followed. Suitable alternative jobs. If you offer an employee a suitable alternative job and they unreasonably refuse it, they lose their entitlement to redundancy pay. They are entitled to a trial period of up to 4 weeks. And all this comes down to unfair dismissal in terms of the law. Are we dealing with dismissals fairly? In other words, is it genuinely redundancy? If it is, then it's a potentially fair reason. And have we followed a fair and reasonable process in the way we've gone about carrying out the redundancies? Remember that even if we get it wrong, somebody might have a claim, but if we can show that the process itself wasn't quite fair, but the end result would have been the same had we followed a fair process, there might be what we call a POLKI, named after a case, a POLKI reduction in compensation. In other words, it would have made no difference and the compensation would be nominal. Should you offer a right of appeal when somebody's dismissed for redundancy? There's no requirement in law to do it, but I would say yes, you should, because it could be looked at one small piece in the overall picture of fairness. And really, that's all I have to say. I want to leave time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for sharing that with us, and also for joining us for the Q&A section as well. Much appreciated. Please do continue to post any questions or thoughts that you might have on the Q&A tab. I'm just looking at the questions now. We have one which I think is probably for you, Alan.
Yeah.
If I read it out here. If you feel due to a if you feel due to a restructure due to financial efficiencies, what's the ruling around apprentices? And the audience member posing the question has said, I see you can make an apprentice redundant on some sites, but then conflicting information that they are protected. Do you have any thoughts there, please, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, they are protected in some sense because an apprentice, remember, it's setting up their career and terminating that apprenticeship early in circumstances where they may struggle to find another one could be the end of their training. But they're not. They don't have any preferential treatment. If there's a need to reduce employees, you would consult with them like any other employee. And if you've got a fair reason for dismissal and you've consulted and you've looked at alternatives, you would do your level best to ensure they could continue their apprenticeship, but they don't have absolute protection. That's the best advice I can give.
Great, thank you very much, Alan, there. And a question for Katie, if that's okay, Katie, and for any other of our panelists who'd like to chip in on this one. You mentioned really interestingly around encouraging leaders to be out and about talking to people and role plays with managers. Are there any other tips about how we can best work with leaders and managers to be helping create this compassionate workplace? Obviously, HR can't do this on their own. We need the whole business to be creating this culture.
That's a great question. And I think one of the challenges is if you're trying to get them to do some of these things right now before this process and they're not used to doing it, you have a big uphill battle in terms of lots of work to be done. So I would say, the more we can invest in our leaders and our managers, the easier any kind of difficult process is going to be. So if you haven't started yet, start soon and it will pay off in dividends. Some of the things that I think are really important is, anyone who's working in a business partnering function, I always feel that our jobs are to make our leaders and our managers be the best version of themselves that they possibly can be. So helping to talk things through in terms of different situations with them. It's always really helpful during these kind of situations to block out lots of time to be able to help answer questions that they have, help equip them with FAQs that they can help to answer, as I say, lots of training, lots of FaceTime with them, and FaceTime can be Zoom calls as well. It doesn't have to be in person. Where you're really helping to answer their questions, their fears, their anxieties. They're going through a lot of emotions and have a lot of questions too. So spending the time with them, encouraging and reminding people to be out there. And one of the things that we do as human beings, I think, is if we know that there is bad news coming, we start to withdraw from our employees in the organization at a time that they need us most. And when I say we, I mean our leaders and our managers as well. So even prompting and reminding people that now more than ever, they need to be more visible. If they're in an office, they need to walk the floor and build those relationships. If they're not in an office, it's even more important to set up one-to-one time, do skip level meetings and really get a good read. Other things that I've encouraged managers and leaders to do, which has worked quite well, is set up listening sessions, throughout a change process. It could be like an open office hours where people can just come with questions. If you use Slack and you're more of a kind of tech-oriented company, doing like an Ask Me Anything on Slack at a certain time, during each week, weekly, while you're going through some of the changes, really helps. And as HR professionals, you can be on that, supporting the leaders and the managers during those processes. I hope that helps.
That does, Katie. Loads of practical tips there. Thank you very much for sharing that one. And then we have one final question. We've only got a couple of minutes, but I've seen another question come through. Maybe this is for you, Alan. Is there any relationship between redundancy pay and pension? Is that something that you might be able to answer?
Yeah, I can answer that for you. Thank you very much, Jill. Redundancy pay and pension. Let's see. So when you're made redundant, you'll have to be given your notice. So if you're required to work out your notice, you'll pay your salary as normal for the notice period. And of course, that will include the employer pension contribution, and the employee's pension contribution will be deducted from that as well. But other than that, no, you should be paid what you are due for your notice period. That's the connection. The redundancy pay element itself, the statutory redundancy pay, bears no relevance to the pension. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan.
Thank you.
Great, and I think we've tackled most of the questions that were posted, so thank you very much. And we're coming to the end of the webinar now. So the last thing that's for me is to wrap up the session today. Firstly, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our speakers for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. So thank you very much for joining us today. Also to our audience for posting your questions, posting your comments. Thank you very much for your contributions. And also, of course, to the CIPD team behind the webinar for setting this up today. The final things from me to mention is the webinar will be available on demand later today, along with the slides. So feel free to re-watch the webinar. We'll have future webinars listed on our website as well that you might be interested in. And then lastly, please don't forget CIPD's wellbeing support for members in UK and Ireland, with a free 24/7 telephone helpline, staffed by qualified therapists and provided by award-winning workplace wellbeing provider, Health Assured. So thank you very much and look forward to seeing you on our webinar again soon.